that. Wear this diamond I'm going to give you instead. Okay, maybe you can see why she was suggesting that. So anyhow, this is the kind of ring she's referring to. This is another memorial ring. This one's actually slightly later, but again, it's gold with black enamel. The bezel in the middle there is actually in the shape of a coffin, very deliberately. Inside, it has the human hair of the deceased person. So again, don't wear that. Wear this diamond. And it's not even clear if she's talking about a diamond ring or just a diamond gem, which I discuss in the book. A lot of times women focus on a gem and don't talk about whether it's on a bracelet or a necklace or a ring, because those round shapes could invoke body connotations that male poets played with. But if you focus on the gem itself, that's more likely to suggest attributes like chastity, purity, loyalty, and so forth. So anyhow, Eliza's saying, not that. This is a hair bracelet. And actually some very famous canonical English Renaissance poems are written about hair bracelets. John Donne likes to write about hair bracelets. And this is an especially ornate one, so the idea would be that the woman would work on this kind of artistic rendering of her hair and give it as a love token to her male beloved or her husband, and then he would wear it as a token that would identify her as his lover. And this made a big difference to me, by the way, in understanding some Renaissance poetry, to see that this is what they're talking about. Because before, my understanding of what a hair bracelet was imaginatively impoverished, since I just assumed that it was a little twist of hair. I just thought, okay, so you cut some hair, you braid it, and then you tie it around your wrist. Apparently, I would have not been so skilled at the sort of hair bracelet artistic arena. Okay, so, and then I think we just have the image of the ring that's on the cover. This was a 17th century German marriage ring, and it's a Gimbal ring, although it's an especially fancy one because Gimbal rings are usually two pieces, right? So the Gimbal suggests that they are twinned. Right, so two rings that can be folded back together, and in this case it's three. And so that's meant to suggest the kind of intertwining of the lovers and the fact that they can't be separated. And then there's also another image of it facing. And those are the two images that are on the cover of the book. So that's what it looks like when it's folded. So those are the same ring, if you understand. So one is from above with it open, and the other is looking at it dead on, like that, right? So. And so this one is a diamond with a heart background and two hands. So it's also the mani and fede, sort of the two hands holding around the heart. So this ring is overloaded with symbolism suggesting loyalty and sort of eternal togetherness. I look at a lot of poetry in this book written by men and women, and I've indicated already very briefly what some of the differences are between the men and the women. But it turns out there are also significant differences among the women as poets too. So you can't just assume that the women are all writing in the same way all the time. So there were limits to English Renaissance women poets' similarities to each other when writing about material objects. For example, personal socioeconomic power, which relates to factors such as social rank and riches, strongly impacted women's poetic portraits of their relations to real property. But this is much less the case in relation to love tokens, forms of movable property. So in other words, the wealthier a woman was, or the higher ranking she was, would have a strong impact in how she would write about real estate. And it's counterintuitive because she would actually almost erase herself in relation to real estate. So the more powerful a woman was, socially speaking, the more she would actually downplay her ability to own real property. That was one of the strangest things that I found in the book. Whereas women who were even almost impoverished would write poems that were very, very celebratory of owning things that they couldn't possibly own, like the entire city of London. Verse penned by single women who have not been married. Remember that Eliza was a wife writing under coverture. So single women who've not been married also made exceptionally daring challenges to patriarchal ideas about women's control over and possession of material items. So those are some of the differences among women. But despite these differences, there's still an important overall collective cultural effect of women's poetry about material objects. Regardless of the parameters of women's actual power during the English Renaissance, their poetry about material possessions allowed them not only to imagine controlling specific objects, such as love tokens or real estate, but also to imagine extending that control over people, including men. Although women were legally, economically, and culturally constrained in comparison to men in their relations to material items, Their poetry envisions a diverse, expansive, and in some cases even liberating, world of possibilities for women within the ongoing daily interactions among people and things, human and non-human subjects and objects. Thanks.
You're looking at a very long time period, and you mentioned that many of the texts were not published, and I assume not circulated widely. So I was just wondering if the women who are write about things, different things in this wide range of objects that you're looking at, or if they write about those things in a different way in documents that are not circulated compared to things that are published or are circulated. And for the things that aren't circulated, I'm curious as to what they are and who was reading them. Are they letters? Are they diaries? Were there folks who were, other than the recipient of the letter, were there people who had access to them? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, it would. Some of these things you'd have to take on a case-by-case basis with manuscript writings. But the first thing I would have to say about it is that we tend to think of what we write by hand as being automatically private and something that doesn't circulate. But in the 16th and 17th centuries in England, manuscript and print were competing technologies, and manuscript actually was still the technology, the writing technology that had more prestige. And it circulated, so that John Donne's poems actually circulated very widely in manuscript. And so part of it is an issue that just has to do with the history of technology, and this is part of the reason why it's taken a while for people to pay attention to this kind of writing, because we've sort of assumed that a text needs to be printed and circulated in a capitalist market for it to have a wide readership and for it to be valuable. But in the Renaissance instead, manuscript texts could circulate, and they were often seen as more prestigious if they were handwritten instead of printed. Print was often associated with something that was potentially cheap. In the 16th century, it could even have connotations of being kind of vulgar in the sense of being too common. So, okay, so that said, in the case of women's manuscripts, you'd have to kind of look at them case by case, because a lot of times this was a matter of coteries that were extended family coteries, so that they may circulate further than we would think today, but in the context of manuscript circulation, they may not have circulated as widely as some of the male texts, like John Donne's.
During the Renaissance, did they have the salons, the poetry salons that they had, let's say around the time of Voltaire in France, where women would also go to poetry salon, and as a matter of fact, Voltaire's mistress would go dressed as a man to a poetry salon and actually participate in reading poetry. Have you seen any writing in those writings? Have you seen any mention of the poetry salons?
Not quite like that. So that is a cultural difference, because that there were communal situations that involved women's writing, but they weren't quite like that. So basically what you would have would be, for instance, at the state Penshurst that was owned by the Sidney family. So the Sidneys were themselves writers, and they were also patrons of a number of important writers of the day. And so they would effectively have, in their households, they might actually have sort of an informal exchange of literature and so forth. So under courtly patronage, that would be one way in which men and women both could participate, and there were a lot of female patrons in particular. And that's been known for a while, that a lot of very powerful women were patrons of male writing in the time period. And then also families. And one thing that people are doing more work on now is that it turns out that some Renaissance families in England were very committed to having the women of the family write. So that although there have been assumptions suggesting that basically we should all just start from the position of believing that women were told they should not write in the time period, that in the context of families, especially elite families, sometimes having a writing woman in the family, a wife or a daughter, could be seen as a sign of prestige or something honorable for the family. So that, and there's increasing work on that, the idea that family contexts were actually encouraging, in some instances, of women writers. So there were collectivities, but not exactly the salon situation. Thanks for coming, everybody.